Some buildings in my neighborhood stay empty forever. Now I know why. Part 3. I did fully intend on abandoning my project and ceasing my research into the Enochian writings in the little black book. But fate forced my hand. The next morning I woke up alone, with no signs that Jenna had returned home at all. This wasn't surprising. I assumed she'd spent the night at the station or gone to her parents' house in South Pasadena in order to take advantage of their air conditioning. It was a Saturday and there was no food in the apartment, so I decided to walk to a bistro a half-mile down my street which claimed to serve the best French toast in Los Angeles. In the bright mid-morning daylight, my disturbing conversations the night before seemed barely worthy of a second thought. Emma seemed like the type who'd exaggerate things, and Nancy was batshit crazy. Then, right across the street from the bistro, I looked up and caught sight of red, faded graffiti, a 7 with an extra wave, and a curly NL, the Hebrew name of God. It was on a lamppost this time. I took in the building in front of me. It was an elegant place in the old style that once drew business to Koreatown, tan cinderblock walls accented with ornate, glazed terracotta columns. It looked empty. The door gated and dead-bolted and the windows covered by black curtains. And, at the top of each of the finely crafted columns was a bas-relief water pitcher, with a rounded bottom and a curled handle. I felt the heat drain from my body. The longer I stared at the carved ceramic pitcher, the surer I was there was something watching me from behind the dark curtains. I decided I was fine with coffee for breakfast. Back in my apartment, I took out the note with the blotchy, ink-drawn grid with a pentagon that had fallen out of my little black Enoch book, which I'd kept folded in my desk drawer. I looked at the 5 pictures again. A spoked wheel, 3 interlocking circles, a cross with a third line, a butterfly, and a pitcher. A pitcher with a rounded bottom and a curled handle. The drawing of the pitcher, the exact same picture I'd seen in bas-relief on the wall of an abandoned building, must have indicated something for, well, whichever audience the artist had in mind. For whoever went around spray painting in Old Hebrew. The picture pictograph was at the bottom left corner of the pentagon. The picture at the bottom right was the spoked wheel. I thought about it. The empty lot across from the Werner building, where I'd seen the first spray-painted 7 and curly N, was located on the same street as the abandoned building with the ornate columns, further west. So the drawing really was a map. It was a map of Koreatown, of my neighborhood. In 5 minutes, I'd figured out which streets were indicated by the grid. 20 minutes on Google later, I'd learned a few things about the empty lot across the street from the Werner building. There had once been a lovely Art Deco building there. It sat, empty and collapsing, for 5 years before it was demolished in 2015. Before that, it changed hands often. 10 years ago. In 2007, it had been a seafood restaurant for a short time, with elaborate signage. A giant, neon ship wheel. I found the remaining 3 sets of red Hebrew letters before nightfall. Google Maps told me the first 2 were exactly half a mile from each other. I moved diagonally north and west a half mile until I came to a boarded-up mechanic's shop. The entire place was tagged, but I found the 7 and the curved N graffitied on the asphalt. Remnants of a nameplate hung from the ceiling of a rusting carport. The garage logo was 3 interlocking circles. There was something implacably eerie about the rundown hovel, a feeling akin to the aura that hangs perpetually over secluded rest stops and empty elementary schools. I felt a near immediate urge to leave. The next point, the furthest north, was a Gothic-styled Armenian Orthodox church. Had been an Armenian Orthodox church. The large wooden doors were padlocked, the parking lot was cracking. The 3-line cross at the entrance was rusted, and the red logograms were painted on a low cobblestone in the wall. It may have been in response to the darkness of the aesthetic, but the nerve-tingling eeriness I'd felt at the garage came back with a vengeance. I stared into the pitch-black windows, half expecting to see an awful face staring back at me. Finally, I made my way to the 5th point. The point signified by a butterfly pictograph. I'd been there before. I recognized the meshed, barbed-wired fence. The red brick apartment building across the street. For the second time, I stared into the pit. Construction was about to start. There were parked trucks and unloaded raw materials. I walked the length of the fence, but I couldn't find the distinctive graffiti anywhere. It made sense. Whatever the 7 and N had been spray painted onto was probably scrap wood now. I walked home after that. Still no Jenna. I called her 3 times, straight to voicemail each time. This was weird. Jenna was usually good about keeping her phone charged. Next, I called Adrienne. I'd express mailed the little black book to her a week before, and hoped she could offer some context as to the meaning of the 4 spray-painted names of God. 3 more rings. Then once more, voicemail. My apartment was stifling. I felt my eyes shift to the doors and windows. I became preoccupied with the possibility there was something hiding behind them. My anxiety grew more palpable as morning turned to afternoon. 4 graffitied letters. 4 abandoned buildings. A map, shoved inside a book written in a mystical language developed by a 16th century black magician. Abandoned by a mysterious sect who'd fled in the dead of night. This Christian group, the Religious Nuts, as Shannon had called them, had been up to something. 10 years ago. They'd left in a hurry 10 years ago. 10 years ago. The mid-city mauler committed his murders 10 years ago. I then remembered something Nancy had said. It was the cult. The cult called them here with black magic. I left my apartment. Jenna still wasn't answering her phone, and I felt like I was going crazy. I decided to walk back to the page turner, where I'd found the little black book in the first place, to see if Shannon could offer any more details about her predecessors. But when I got there, I found the shop closed for the night. They're only open until 4. I turned around. The page turner was situated adjacent to an alley along the side of a movie theater that primarily played Korean films. I'd seen employees there before, eating lunch or playing on their phones. That evening, a middle-aged woman loitered alone, smoking a cigarette. She wore the uniform of a ticket taker, and she had a name tag. Louise. Find Louise. She'd tell you. I smiled and walked over to her, asked to bum a cigarette. She pulled one out of her pack and offered me her lighter. So, have you worked here long? I asked innocently. She nodded. Longer than you've been alive, sweetheart. Do you know Shannon? The woman who owns the used bookstore. In passing, Louise said. She seems decent. A step up from the creeps who rented the space before her. I listened intently. I'd intended to shepherd the conversation towards the topic of the maybe cultists, but Louise was obviously eager to talk about them. Oh, I said. Who had the space before her? Louise finished her cigarette, lit another one. It was a record store for years and years. When that shop went under in 05, 06, the space was on the market for a long time. Then, middle of 07, they showed up. People, Louise said plainly. I came into work one morning, and they'd completely moved in. There was a sign up, the Church of Revelations. Didn't look much like a church. No cross. No nothing. They blacked out the windows with curtains. I went in there, once. About a week later, just to check it out. The door was unlocked. They had the place really sparsely decorated. There was a girl behind the front desk, with a phone and a desktop computer. Maybe 20, Asian, round face. She looked at me as though I were the least interesting thing in the world. I asked what kind of church they were. Reform, she said. They didn't believe in doodads and bells and whistles. I asked if I could join the church. She said I'd have to come back when the parson was in. Did you ever go back? I asked. She shook her head. I lost interest, for the moment. I did see people coming and going, though. Sometimes they'd come back here and smoke with us. What were they like? She made a face. Just people. There was nothing particularly exciting about them. Different ages, different races. Dressed like everyone else, talked about the same things everyone else was talking about. But for some reason, They gave me the heebie-jeebies. Anyways, they seemed to like talking to us, asking us questions about the neighborhood. Subtly. Not pushy or anything. They were looking for a bigger space. A 40-ish blonde woman told me once. She asked if I knew any other spaces for rent in the neighborhood. Preferably ones that had been empty for a while or ran through tenants fast. Cheaper places. I didn't, and I told her so. But a few days later, a black guy, maybe 35, from the church asked a similar question when I was out here smoking with a janitor named Roy. He asked us if anywhere around here had a reputation for being haunted. He liked ghost stories, he said. Something in me told me I shouldn't give him an answer. Roy, though, jabbered on and on. There used to be an Italian joint on Olympic, he said. Everyone thought it was cursed. There'd been 9 owners in 15 years. In 3 separate incidents, a guest dropped dead of a heart attack. They'd been robbed twice in the last year, and once, a cook had been badly disfigured after an unexplained gas explosion. The abandoned building on Olympic with the bas-relief picture, where I'd been that morning, was this. I asked carefully, around the same time as the murders 10 years ago. The Mid-City Mauler. She nodded. I was getting to that. It was around the time they found the poor man dissected in the back of that coffee shop. I used to take the bus a whole lot then, so I had some acquaintances of the vagabond variety. Now, everyone was paranoid with all the animal mutilations and the disappearances, but the homeless were on a whole other level. The murderer, the Mid-City Mauler, I guess they called him, wasn't a human being. No. They saw things. The bums all said. People dressed in black cloaks and scarves that covered their faces, running around at night. And people who weren't people. What do you mean, weren't people? I asked. I mean human-shaped things with beaks. Humans with webbed feet, digging through dumpsters late at night. Humans with too many arms and legs, scaling the sides of buildings like cockroaches. An icy chill spilled over my body. The digging man in the alley. He had 3 hands. So, in light of all that, I was more than a little suspicious of Mr. Ghost Story Fanatic. So I followed him. I tailed him, just like I expected, right to an abandoned restaurant on Olympic. He went around the back entrance, where they used to receive deliveries. I hid behind a dumpster. I watched him walk right up to the back employee door, pull a screwdriver-looking thing out of his bag, and pop the lock like it was nothing, then disappear inside. I sat there for hours, until it got dark. Then a white van pulled up to the loading dock. Windowless. No license plate. There were 3 of them. 3 people, all in black. 2 men and a woman. They pulled cases out of the van, big, black cases. They loaded it all inside. I didn't dare try and sneak into the restaurant, no way. I heard jackhammering. Then a hum. The hum. I asked. Like the hum of machinery. She answered. I felt the ground vibrate. I felt it in my bones. And it got lower and lower, until it was this reverberating, inhuman growl like the bowels of a freight train. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran. Whatever those people were doing there, it wasn't Christianity. She took a long drag on her cigarette. Mine, forgotten, had gone out. This is my last shift. Actually, Louise said finally. I've got a sister in Lancaster. I'm going to go in live with her for a while. And if you were smart, you'd get out, too. My blood ran cold. I couldn't bring myself to ask why. That church, she said distastefully. They packed up and left real quick a few weeks after. I think the cops were coming around, asking them questions they didn't like. As soon as they were gone, the problem stopped. No more humanoid entities sneaking about. No more weird noises at night, no more disappearances. I tried looking them up online, and got nowhere. As far as official sources are concerned, the Church of Revelations doesn't exist. And unofficial sources? I asked. Louise took another long drag. A cousin of mine lived in Missouri. a little town out there. He said that in the 90s, they'd had a rash of unexplained disappearances and animal mutilations. And, he said, some religious group showed up. The Apostles of St. Michael. They went by. He got real close with one of the women. She wouldn't tell him much, but she did say she'd traveled with the church all over the world. And once, drunk. Offhand, she referred to the Apostles of St. Michael by another name. Blacklight. Blacklight. I repeated. So what's that got to do with you leaving town? She sighed. Her cigarette burned to ash. She looked at me, pure terror on her face. I saw one, she breathed. One what? I didn't need to ask her. It was outside a business park. She continued. Crouched like an animal, lapping water out of a fountain. It looked like a person, except its face was too long and its eyes glowed in the dark. And, when it saw me, it skittered off into the shadows on all fours. Except its limbs bent the wrong way. That night, I walked past the empty lot across the street from the Werner building. I didn't want to, but mentally spiraling, lost in a web of unanswered questions. I crossed the street and there it was. The glaring red 7 and curly N. And the gate, again, unlocked. Scratch, scratch, crunch, scratch. I shouldn't have looked. I don't know why I looked. But I looked. This time, there were 2 of them. 2 people. They crouched low to the ground like chimpanzees, silhouetted in the dim lamplight on the cloudy night. Both digging furiously and, apparently, making some progress. They reached their overlong, emaciated arms deep into a hole, tossing rock and dirt over their shoulders. Baggy clothes hung off their bony frames. 4 spider-like legs splayed awkwardly. I took a step back. The clouds shifted, throwing grayish moonlight over the yellow grass. The hard earth of the empty lot was dotted with hundreds of shallow holes.